There's a moment that happens in every negotiation, every confrontation, every high-stakes conversation. A moment where one person feels an overwhelming compulsion to fill the silence, to explain themselves, to justify their position, to say something, anything, to break the unbearable tension that's building in the air. And the moment they speak, the moment they give in to that compulsion, they lose. Not because what they said was wrong, but because they spoke at all. Because the person sitting across from them, the person who remained silent, who let that tension build and build without flinching, without rushing to ease the discomfort, that person just gained control of the entire situation without saying a single word. This is the power of silence, and it's one of the most misunderstood and underutilized weapons in human interaction, that we live in a world that worships words. We're taught from childhood that communication is about talking, about expressing ourselves, about making sure we're heard. The loudest voice in the room gets the attention. The person with the best argument wins the debate. The one who can articulate their position most eloquently is considered the most intelligent, the most capable, the most worthy of respect. But this entire framework is backwards. Because while everyone else is filling the air with words, competing to be heard, desperate to make their case, the truly powerful people are doing something completely different. They're watching. They're listening. They're letting others reveal themselves through nervous chatter and defensive explanations. And they're using silence as a scalpel, cutting through pretense and posturing to get exactly what they want done. Think about the last time you were in uncomfortable silence. Maybe it was a job interview where the interviewer asked you a question and then just sat there, waiting, even after you finished your answer. Maybe it was a negotiation where you made an offer and the other person said nothing, just looked at you with an unreadable expression. Maybe it was a personal conversation where you tried to explain yourself and the other person gave you nothing back. No reaction, no validation, just empty space where a response should be. What did you do? If you're like most people, you started talking again. You elaborated on your answer. You revised your offer. You over-explained your position. And with every additional word, you gave away information you didn't need to give. You weakened your position. You revealed your anxieties and insecurities. The silence manipulated you into sabotaging yourself, and you didn't even realize it was happening. This is how silence works as a weapon. It's not passive. It's not about having nothing to say. It's about deliberately creating a vacuum that other people feel compelled to fill, and then watching carefully what they fill it with. Because humans are fundamentally uncomfortable with silence, especially in social situations where we expect dialogue and exchange. Silence feels like rejection, like disapproval, like something is wrong that needs to be fixed. And our instinct when we encounter this discomfort is to resolve it as quickly as possible by talking, by explaining, by trying to re-establish connection through words. But every time we do this, we're giving the silent person exactly what they want: information, leverage, and control. Let me show you how this plays out in a negotiation. Because this is where the power of silence becomes most obvious. Imagine you're trying to sell something. Maybe your services, maybe a product, maybe even selling yourself in a job interview. You state your price or your salary requirement. And then comes the critical moment. The other person says nothing. They don't accept. They don't counteroffer. They don't reject. They just sit there, looking at you, waiting. What most people do in this moment is catastrophic. They immediately start talking again. But I'm flexible on that. Or, that's negotiable. Or, I could go lower if needed. They've just negotiated against themselves. They've revised their offer downward without the other person saying a single word, without getting any information about whether the original number was even a problem. The silence made them so uncomfortable that they volunteered a concession nobody asked for. Now imagine the same scenario, but you're the one staying silent. Someone makes you an offer. You say nothing. You don't react. You just maintain eye contact and wait. What happens? They start talking again. They explain why their offer is fair. They add sweeteners. They reveal their constraints, their timeline, their pressure points. We really need someone. To start by next month, or this is actually above what we budgeted, but we really want you. Or I could probably find a bit more room if that's important to you. With every additional sentence, they're giving you information about their position, their needs, their flexibility. And you got all of it without asking a single question, without revealing anything about your own position. You just stayed silent and let their discomfort work for you. But silence is more than just a negotiation tactic. It's a fundamental shift in how you understand power dynamics in any interaction. Most people think power comes from having the best arguments, the most knowledge, the strongest case. But actual power comes from information asymmetry. The person who knows more about the other person's position, needs, fears, and constraints has the advantage. And the fastest way to gain that information is not by asking clever questions. It's by being silent and letting other people volunteer it freely, because they can't stand the discomfort of empty space in conversation. There's a particular type of silence that's especially powerful. And it's the one that comes after someone tries to provoke you, tries to get an emotional reaction, tries to draw you into a conflict or argument. Someone insults you, challenges you, says something designed to make you defensive. And you say nothing. You don't defend yourself. You don't counterattack. You don't try to set the record straight. You just look at them calmly and remain silent. This does something devastating to the person who was trying to provoke you. Because they launched an attack, they expended energy and emotion, they revealed their hostility or insecurity, and they got nothing back. The attack just hangs there in the air, making them look petty or aggressive or insecure, while you look unbothered and in control. They wanted to pull you into their emotional state, wanted to make you react at their level. And your silence denied them that satisfaction while simultaneously exposing them. Think about how this pattern plays out in everyday interactions. Someone makes a passive-aggressive comment. Someone questions your competence. Someone tries to undermine you in a meeting. The instinct is to respond, to defend yourself, to make your case. But watch what happens when you don't. When you simply acknowledge their statement with silence and move on. That's an interesting perspective, and then nothing. Or even better, just a slight nod and continued silence. The person who made the attack is now in an awkward position. They revealed their hostility without getting the satisfaction of seeing it land. Other people in the room notice the attack and your non-reaction, and your composure makes you look strong while the attacker looks petty. You've won without engaging. This is why the most powerful people you've ever encountered probably weren't the loudest people in the room. They were the ones who spoke rarely, but were listened to intently when they did speak. Because they understand something fundamental about human psychology. Scarcity creates value. When you talk constantly, your words become background noise. When you always have an opinion, people stop caring what you think. But when you're selective, when you speak only when you have something meaningful to say, when you're comfortable with silence, even when others aren't, suddenly every word you do say carries weight. People lean in. They listen carefully. They assign significance to your statements because you've demonstrated through your silence that you're not someone who wastes words. There's a particular application of this principle that's brutally effective in any competitive environment, whether it's business, politics, or even social dynamics. It's the strategy of letting your opponents talk themselves into corners while you remain silent. Watch how this works. Someone is explaining their position, making their case, building their argument. Most people think the way to counter this is to jump in with your own argument, to challenge their points, to debate them. But here's what the silent strategist does. They let the person keep talking. They ask minimal, open-ended questions. Tell me more about that. How would that work? And then silence. More listening. More waiting. What happens is that most people, given enough rope and enough silence to fill, will eventually contradict themselves, reveal flaws in their logic, or expose vulnerabilities in their position. They'll keep elaborating, keep explaining, keep adding details, and somewhere in that verbal avalanche, they'll say something that undermines their own case. And they'll do it to themselves, without you having to attack or challenge anything. You just had to be patient enough to stay silent and let them talk themselves out. Because most people's positions aren't nearly as solid as they initially present them to be. When they have to fill silence, when they have to keep talking without feedback or pushback, they expose the gaps and contradictions that were there all along. But there's a darker application of silence, one that's used deliberately to hurt and control, and it's important to recognize this so you can defend against it. This is the silent treatment, the weaponized withdrawal of communication designed to punish and manipulate. This is different from strategic silence in negotiation or conversation. This is silence used to create anxiety, to establish dominance through withholding, to make someone feel powerless by refusing to engage. Someone who uses the silent treatment isn't staying quiet to gather information or maintain composure. They're using silence as a form of psychological punishment, creating emotional pain through deliberate disconnection. The reason this works as manipulation is because it exploits our fundamental need for social connection and communication. When someone refuses to speak to us, refuses to acknowledge us, gives us the cold shoulder, it triggers deep anxiety. We become desperate to restore the connection, to understand what we did wrong, to fix whatever caused the silence. And in that desperate state, we'll often do whatever the silent person wants, concede to their demands, accept their frame, just to end the painful disconnection. This is why the silent treatment is a favorite tool of emotional manipulators. It's a low-effort, high-impact way to control someone's behavior without having to explicitly state demands or justify positions. But here's how you defend against this kind of weaponized silence. You refuse to let it create anxiety in you. You recognize it for what it is, a manipulation tactic, and you don't give it the power the manipulator wants it to have. When someone gives you the silent treatment, trying to punish you into compliance, you don't chase them. You don't beg for communication. You don't anxiously try to guess what you did wrong and apologize for everything. You simply proceed with your life as if their silence is their choice and their problem. You maintain your own sense of peace and self-worth independent of their approval or communication. And usually, when the silent treatment doesn't produce the desired anxiety and chasing behavior, the manipulator either gives up or has to actually communicate like an adult instead of using silence as a weapon. The key distinction here is intent and context. Strategic silence in negotiation or confrontation is about maintaining composure, gathering information, and not giving away your position unnecessarily. It's a form of strength and self-control. Weaponized silence as punishment is about creating pain and anxiety to control someone's behavior. It's manipulation. One is playing defense and offense in a competitive situation. The other is abuse in a relationship that should be based on mutual respect and communication. Understanding the difference helps you use silence powerfully when appropriate, and recognize when it's being used against you maliciously. Now let's talk about perhaps the most sophisticated use of silence, and that's in leadership. The leaders who command the most respect and actually get the most information aren't the ones constantly talking, constantly giving their opinions, constantly directing every conversation. They're the ones who ask a question and then shut up, who bring people together and then listen more than they speak, who create space for others to fill with their ideas, concerns, and information. Because when a leader talks constantly, several things happen. They stop learning anything new because they're only hearing their own thoughts. They train their team to be passive because there's no room for anyone else's voice. And they never find out what people really think because everyone knows the leader has already decided and is just looking for agreement. But a leader who uses silence strategically, who asks probing questions and then waits, who sits in meetings and lets others debate while they observe, that leader is gathering intelligence constantly. They're seeing who thinks clearly under pressure. They're noticing who dominates conversations and who gets talked over. They're hearing the concerns and ideas that people are actually working with, not just the polished versions people present to authority. And when they do speak, after all that careful observation and listening, they have context and understanding that lets them make better decisions and have more impact. Their words carry weight because they've demonstrated that they use silence to understand. Before they use words to direct. There's also something profound that happens in your own mind. When you practice strategic silence, most people's thoughts are chaotic and reactive because they're constantly externalizing them, constantly talking, constantly responding. But when you train yourself to stay silent, especially in moments when you feel the urge to speak, you create space for your own thinking to develop depth. You notice that your first reaction isn't always your best reaction. You catch yourself before you say something defensive or reactive or stupid. You give yourself time to think through implications and consequences. You become more deliberate and less impulsive. The silence isn't just a weapon you use on others. It's a tool for developing your own clarity and control. Here's a practical challenge that will teach you more about power dynamics than any book for the next week. Practice strategic silence in your conversations. When someone asks you a question, especially in a negotiation or any situation with stakes, answer briefly and then stop. Don't elaborate unless asked. Don't fill silence. When someone tries to provoke you or criticize you, respond with silence or a minimal acknowledgement and then say nothing else. When someone makes you an offer, say nothing. Just look at them and wait. See what happens. Count how many times people revise their positions, volunteer additional information, or get uncomfortable and start talking more when you simply refuse to fill the silence. You'll discover something unsettling. Most of the talking you do is unnecessary. Most of your explanations and justifications and elaborations are working against you, giving away information and leverage for free. You'll see people negotiating against themselves because you stayed quiet. You'll watch people reveal things they never would have revealed if you've been busy talking. You'll notice that people start listening more carefully to you because you speak less, and what you do say carries more weight. And you'll feel the power that comes from not being controlled by your own compulsion to fill every silence with words. But there's one final aspect of silence that's rarely discussed, and it's the most important one: silence as a test of character. When you can sit comfortably in silence, when you don't need to fill every gap with noise, when you're not desperate for validation or connection or to be heard, you demonstrate something fundamental about your self-possession and inner security. People who can't tolerate silence are usually people who can't tolerate being alone with their own thoughts, who need constant external validation and distraction, who lack the internal stability to just be without performance or defense. But someone who's comfortable with silence, who can sit in it without anxiety or compulsion, that person radiates a different kind of power. It's the power of not needing anything from the moment, not needing to control or convince or defend, just being present, observing, and choosing when and if to speak. This is why silence is ultimately more powerful than speech. Because speech is about adding something to the environment, while silence is about having enough confidence and control to add nothing. Speech reveals while silence observes. Speech reacts, while silence chooses. Speech fills space desperately, while silence creates space deliberately. And in a world where everyone is talking, competing for attention, desperate to be heard, the person who understands when to say nothing is the person who understands where real power actually lives. Not in the words you say, but in the words you don't need to say. Not in filling silence, but in creating it and letting others reveal themselves, trying to escape it. So the next time you're in a conversation that matters, try this. Speak half as much as you think you should. Answer questions briefly. Don't elaborate unless asked. Don't fill pauses. Don't explain or justify beyond what's necessary. Just watch what happens. Watch how other people start talking more. Watch how they volunteer information you didn't ask for. Watch how they become uncomfortable and start making concessions or revelations just to fill the space you're refusing to fill. And then you'll understand what the most powerful people have always known. Silence isn't the absence of communication. It's the most sophisticated form of it. And the person who masters it has a weapon that never runs out of ammunition, never makes noise, and never misses.